The gavel echoed like a gunshot, but my father's roar shattered my world. "She is an embarrassment to this family," he screamed, pointing directly at me. I braced for the inevitable guilty verdict. Then, Judge Caldwell leaned forward and asked the one question that would destroy my father's life forever. "My name is Clara Higgins. If you lived anywhere near Seattle, Washington in the past decade, you likely know my last name." Higgins Heritage Realty was a titan in the commercial real estate sector, responsible for reshaping the downtown skyline. The face of that empire was my father, Richard Higgins, a man whose charm was as legendary as his ruthlessness. He was the kind of man who could foreclose on an orphanage and make the evening news believe he was doing the city a favor. For the first 24 years of my life, I worshipped him. My biological mother passed away from ovarian cancer when I was barely 6 years old, leaving me alone in a sprawling mansion with a man who viewed vulnerability as a character flaw. Less than a year after her funeral, Richard married Sylvia, a former beauty queen with a taste for the finer things and a distinct distaste for me. Soon after, my half-sister Beatrice was born. Beatrice was the golden child, the perfect heir who inherited Sylvia's flawless cheekbones and my father's arrogant smirk. I, on the other hand, was the quiet workhorse, the reminder of a past my father wanted to forget. I spent my entire life trying to earn a fraction of the affection he showered on Beatrice. While she was taking gap years in Milan and crashing luxury sports cars, I was pulling all-nighters at the University of Washington, earning my CPA. When I graduated at the top of my class, my father finally offered me a place in the empire. I wasn't given a corner office or a VP title like Beatrice was on her 21st birthday. I was made a junior internal auditor, a glorified bean counter buried in the windowless basement of the Higgins Tower, but I didn't care. I was finally part of the family business. I was finally useful to him. I should have known that in my father's world, useful was just another word for expendable. The nightmare began on a rainy Tuesday in late November. I was running a routine quarterly audit on a massive waterfront development known as the Highland Creek Project. It was a multi-million-dollar venture, subsidized heavily by city grants. As I cross-referenced the vendor invoices with our outbound wire transfers, I noticed a discrepancy. It wasn't a small rounding error. It was a gaping, bleeding hole in the ledgers. Over the course of 18 months, exactly $3.4 million had been siphoned out of the project's operational budget and funneled into an offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Apex Holdings LLC. The authorization signatures on the wire transfers were highly classified, restricted only to top-tier executives. Panic gripped my chest. I thought we were being hacked, or worse, that a senior partner was embezzling. Driven by a desperate need to protect my father's legacy, I printed the damning logs, shoved them into a manila folder, and took the elevator directly to the penthouse suite. When I burst into Richard's office, he was pouring himself a glass of expensive scotch. I laid the documents on his mahogany desk, my hands shaking. I explained the phantom accounts, the missing millions, the sheer scale of the fraud. I expected him to rage. I expected him to immediately call the legal department. Instead, he smiled. It was a cold, perfectly practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He walked around his desk, placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "Clara, my bright, diligent girl," he murmured, picking up the folder. "You always were too smart for your own good. This is a complex tax mitigation strategy. It's high-level corporate finance, way above the pay grade of a junior auditor. But I appreciate your vigilance. I'll have the CFO look into the routing immediately. Now, be a good girl, go back downstairs, and forget you ever saw this." I believed him. Or rather, I forced myself to believe him, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. 3 days later, I was violently awakened at 6:00 a.m. by the sound of my front door being battered off its hinges. Armed FBI agents swarmed my tiny, one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill. I was dragged out of bed, handcuffed in my pajamas, and forced to sit on my sofa while they tore my life apart. I watched in absolute disbelief as an agent pulled a sleek, black burner laptop from the ventilation grate above my kitchen cabinets, a grate I hadn't touched since I moved in. I watched them pull a leather-bound ledger from beneath my mattress. Clara Higgins, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. The lead agent barked, reciting my Miranda rights as they marched me out into the freezing Seattle rain. I spent the next 48 hours in a holding cell, terrified, confused, and desperately waiting for my father's high-powered lawyers to walk through the door and clear up this terrible misunderstanding. They never came. Instead, the guard turned on the small television in the corner of the cell area during the evening news. There, standing on the steps of the Higgins Tower, surrounded by microphones and flashing cameras, was my father. Sylvia was clutching his arm, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Beatrice stood behind them, looking tragically beautiful. It is with a broken heart that I address the city today. Richard's voice emanated from the screen, thick with perfectly manufactured grief. We have discovered a massive, systemic theft within Higgins Heritage Realty. What hurts the most is not the financial loss, but the betrayal. The evidence is undeniable. My eldest daughter, Clara, has manipulated our systems to steal millions of dollars to fund a secret, lavish lifestyle. I love her, but justice must be served. Higgins Realty is cooperating fully with federal authorities. I stopped breathing. The cold, concrete floor of the cell seemed to drop out from beneath me. The burner laptop, the ledger, the offshore accounts. He hadn't just ignored my warning. He had used my access credentials. He had planted the evidence. My own father had sacrificed me to the slaughterhouse to save himself. 6 months later, the trial of the state of Washington versus Clara Higgins commenced, and it was the biggest media circus the city had seen in decades. I was entirely ruined. The moment I had been arrested, the company froze all my bank accounts, claiming the funds were tainted by criminal enterprise. I was evicted from my apartment. I couldn't afford a private defense attorney, leaving me reliant on a heavily overworked, perpetually exhausted public defender named Kai Pendleton. Kai was a good man, but he was drowning in case files and completely outmatched by the high-profile nature of my trial. I was currently living in a dingy, roach-infested motel on the outskirts of the city, surviving on cheap ramen and the terrifying reality that I was facing up to 25 years in federal prison. By the third day of the trial, the air in courtroom 4B of the King County Courthouse was thick with tension. The gallery was packed to the brim with journalists, gossip columnists, and curious onlookers hungry for the destruction of a wealthy heiress. Presiding over the case was the Honorable Judge Harrison Caldwell. He was an imposing figure in his late 60s, with sharp, hawk-like eyes and a reputation for being entirely impervious to courtroom theatrics. He sat behind the high mahogany bench, his expression unreadable, silently observing every movement in the room. The prosecution was led by Sarah Jenkins, a shark of a lawyer who smelled blood in the water and a promotion on the horizon. For 2 days, she meticulously painted me as a bitter, jealous daughter. She projected photos of Beatrice's luxury vacations and designer wardrobe onto the screens, contrasting them with my modest life. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Jenkins had purred during her opening statements. Clara Higgins was tired of living in the shadows. She wanted the life her sister had. She used her intimate knowledge of the company's financial architecture to siphon away millions, hiding it in the Cayman Islands until the dust settled, planning an escape that was only foiled by a routine internal audit. It was a brilliant, devastating narrative. It was also entirely fabricated. Then came the turning point. The prosecution called their star witness, Richard Higgins. When my father walked through the double oak doors, a hush fell over the gallery. He wore a bespoke, charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than my bail. He walked with the heavy, burdened steps of a grieving patriarch. He refused to look at me as he took the stand and swore on the Bible, a book I knew he only touched for photo ops. Prosecutor Jenkins approached him with a soft, sympathetic tone. "Mr. Higgins, I know this is incredibly difficult for you. Can you tell the court about your relationship with the defendant? Richard let out a shaky sigh, adjusting his cuffs. I tried. God knows I tried, he began, his voice laced with a masterful tremor. Clara. Clara always struggled. After her mother passed, she withdrew. She became resentful of my new wife, Sylvia, and deeply jealous of her sister, Beatrice. Despite her hostility, I wanted to give her a chance. I pushed her to get her CPA. I created that auditing position specifically for her, hoping that bringing her into the family business would finally bridge the gap between us. I sat at the defense table, my fingernails biting so hard into my palms that they drew blood. He was rewriting my entire life. And how did she repay that kindness? Jenkins asked gently. By attempting to destroy the legacy my grandfather built, Richard said, looking mournfully at the jury. My CFO brought me the irregularities. When we investigated, we found the IP addresses linked directly to Clara's terminal. We found her forged authorizations. When I confronted her, she was entirely unrepentant. It broke my heart to call the authorities, but no one is above the law, not even my own flesh and blood. It was a flawless performance. Several members of the jury were looking at him with deep sympathy and looking at me with absolute disgust. Your witness, Jenkins said, taking her seat with a smug smile. Kai Pendleton stood up, looking nervously at his notes. He approached the podium. Mr. Higgins, Kai began, his voice lacking the commanding resonance of the prosecutor. You claim Clara was resentful and hostile. Yet, her performance reviews, signed by you, consistently rate her as an exemplary, dedicated employee. Doesn't that contradict your statement? Richard waved a dismissive hand. I was trying to encourage her, Mr. Pendleton. A father protects his daughter's ego. It was an act of charity. Charity, Kai repeated weakly. Let's talk about the offshore account. Apex Holdings LLC. The prosecution claims Clara set this up. But setting up a Cayman Islands shell corporation requires immense capital and high-level legal connections. Clara's bank records show she lived strictly paycheck to paycheck. How could she afford to establish such an entity? Richard leaned forward, his mask slipping just a fraction, revealing a glimmer of his natural arrogance. She had the keys to the castle, counselor. When you have access to a $3 million slush fund you've created, paying a corrupt offshore lawyer a few $1,000s in stolen retainer fees is child's play. She stole the money to make the account, to steal more money. But there is no digital footprint of her contacting any offshore lawyers, Kai pressed, sweating slightly. The only physical evidence tying her to the account is a handwritten ledger found in her apartment. A ledger that, I might add, was found by an anonymous tip. Richard's face began to redden. He was not a man used to being questioned by men in cheap, off-the-rack suits. The evidence speaks for itself. The FBI found it in her home. A home she was barely in because she was working 80-hour weeks for you, Kai countered, finally finding a bit of rhythm. Isn't it true, Mr. Higgins, that you had a spare key to Clara's apartment? Isn't it true that your company's private security firm handles the alarm systems for all executive family members, giving you unlimited access to her residence? Objection, relevance, and counsel is badgering the witness, Jenkins shouted, leaping to her feet. Overruled, Judge Caldwell said, his deep voice cutting through the noise. You may answer the question, Mr. Higgins. Richard's jaw clenched tightly. He looked at Kai with pure, unadulterated venom. I am the head of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. I do not have the time or the inclination to sneak into my daughter's squalid apartment to plant evidence. The very suggestion is absurd. Then how do you explain the fact that the biometric locks on the Apex Holdings accounts were completely bypassed without Clara's thumbprint? Kai pushed, flipping a page. The forensic tech stated yesterday that the accounts were opened remotely, using a secondary verification. Richard lost his temper. The polished veneer cracked completely, exposing the monster beneath. He slammed his fist down on the wooden railing of the witness box, the sound cracking like a whip through the silent courtroom. He stood up, pointing a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. Because she is a manipulative, lying thief. Richard roared, his face purple with rage. I gave her everything. I kept her out of the gutter. And this is what I get? I am done protecting her. She is an embarrassment to this family. The gallery erupted into shocked murmurs. Jenkins buried her face in her hands. Kai took a stunned step back from the podium. I sat frozen, the hatred in my father's eyes pinning me to my chair. He had just convicted me in the court of public opinion. The jury was staring at him, utterly captivated by his raw, explosive anger. He was reeling them back in, playing the victim pushed to the absolute brink by a psychopathic child. The gavel struck the sounding block. Bang, bang, bang. Order in this court, Judge Caldwell bellowed, his voice echoing with absolute authority. The gallery instantly fell dead silent. Richard, breathing heavily, slowly lowered himself back into the witness chair, smoothing his tie, looking satisfied with his outburst. But Judge Caldwell didn't look at Kai, and he didn't look at the prosecutor. He turned his heavy, piercing gaze directly onto my father. The judge picked up a stack of forensic documents from his bench, adjusted his reading glasses, and leaned forward. Mr. Higgins, Judge Caldwell began, his tone dangerously quiet. You have just testified under oath that your daughter was the sole architect of this massive, complex fraud. You claim she bypassed the biometric security herself, entirely without your knowledge. Yes, Your Honor, Richard said, regaining his composure, dripping with false respect. She is a very cunning girl. Judge Caldwell stared at him for 3 agonizingly long seconds. Then perhaps you can explain something to me, Mr. Higgins. The judge held up a single, glossy piece of paper. Because I was reviewing the forensic data provided by the Cayman Island banking authorities regarding Apex Holdings LLC, the judge lowered the paper, his eyes locking onto my father like a predator about to strike. If your daughter is the sole mastermind of this operation, and if she bypassed the security herself, why does the secondary biometric verification code, the one used to open the account and authorize every single transfer, perfectly match your personal retinal scan? For a moment, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Richard Higgins, the untouchable titan of Seattle real estate, turned the color of wet ash. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by the wide, terrified eyes of a cornered animal. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Prosecutor Sarah Jenkins bolted upright, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. Your Honor, the prosecution has not been provided with this document. What biometric data? Judge Caldwell did not look away from my father. He handed a thick file to the bailiff, gesturing for it to be delivered to the prosecution table. As you are well aware, Miss Jenkins, this trial involves the misappropriation of city-subsidized grants. Yesterday afternoon, the federal task force finalized a mutual legal assistance treaty request with the Cayman banking authorities. The bank, fearing U.S. sanctions, turned over the raw encrypted security logs for Apex Holdings LLC. My clerks finished translating the data an hour before court convened. The primary password was indeed generated from the defendant's workstation. However, the secondary authorization, the failsafe required to move any amount over $50,000, was a retinal scan. A scan that is an exact, microscopic match to the medical records of Richard Higgins. Kai Pendleton, my exhausted, underpaid public defender, suddenly looked like he had been injected with pure adrenaline. He practically vibrated as he stepped back to the podium. Mr. Higgins. Kai's voice boomed, completely devoid of its earlier hesitation. Would you care to explain to this court how your daughter, whom you claim acted entirely alone, managed to extract your eyeball, scan it into a Cayman Islands banking terminal, and place it back into your skull without your knowledge? A few reporters in the gallery let out breathless laughs of shock. The bailiff stepped forward, his hand resting cautiously near his sidearm. It's a fabrication, Richard stammered, gripping the edges of the witness stand so tightly his knuckles were bone white. His immaculate facade was shattering in real time. Hackers, deepfakes, do you know how much money I make? People are constantly trying to steal my identity. Clara must have hired someone on the dark web to synthesize my biometric data. Synthesize a live retinal scan? Judge Caldwell asked dryly, peering over his glasses. The banking log shows the scan was authorized live, via an encrypted mobile application, from an IP address pinging off a cell tower in Aspen, Colorado, on December 14th of last year. I happen to have your company's press releases here, Mr. Higgins. On December 14th, you were in Aspen, attending a commercial real estate summit. Clara Higgins was here in Seattle, swiping her badge into your basement server room at 6:00 a.m. I looked out into the gallery. Sylvia, my stepmother, was no longer dabbing her eyes with her silk handkerchief. She was sitting rigidly, staring at Richard with a look of pure, unadulterated panic. Beatrice had lowered her phone. Her mouth was hanging open. They knew. In that split second, watching their eyes dart around the room, I realized they had known all along. I want my lawyer, Richard breathed, his voice cracking. I am not answering any more questions without corporate counsel present. You are currently on the stand as a witness for the prosecution, Mr. Higgins, and you have sworn an oath, Judge Caldwell warned, his voice like grinding stones. If you refuse to answer, I will hold you in contempt. Then hold me in contempt, Richard snapped, his temper flaring again, a desperate attempt to regain control. This is a witch hunt. I am a pillar of this community. Sarah Jenkins, realizing her star witness was suddenly the prime suspect in a massive federal cover-up, slowly backed away from the podium. She looked at the FBI agent sitting in the front row. Agent Thomas Sterling, the man who had dragged me out of my apartment in handcuffs 6 months ago, was already furiously texting on his phone, his eyes locked on my father. Kai wasn't done. He had the scent of blood. Your Honor, the defense motions to subpoena the outbound wire transfers from Apex Holdings. If Richard Higgins was authorizing the movement of this money, we need to know where it was going. I hypothesized that Clara was framed because she accidentally stumbled upon a slush fund that was being used for purposes far more sinister than personal enrichment. Objection, Jenkins yelled, though her heart clearly wasn't in it anymore. Pure speculation. Is it Miss Jenkins? Judge Caldwell replied, thumbing through the back pages of the forensic report. Because the Cayman authorities were quite thorough, it appears the $3.4 million didn't stay in Apex Holdings. It was immediately washed through a shell corporation in Panama and then deposited into a blind trust held by a Mr. William Garmon. The courtroom erupted. Reporters practically climbed over each other to get out the door and broadcast the news. William Bill Garmon was the Seattle City Zoning Commissioner. He was the man who had inexplicably fast-tracked the environmental permits for the Highland Creek project, the very project I had been auditing. My father hadn't just embezzled his own company's money, he had stolen millions in city grant subsidies to bribe a government official, securing variances that would make him billions. And when I had walked into his office with the audit discrepancies, I hadn't uncovered a tax mistake. I had uncovered a massive federal felony. I was the perfect scapegoat. Order! Judge Caldwell slammed his gavel, but the chaos was absolute. Richard looked at me. For the first time in my life, I didn't see the condescending, arrogant patriarch. I saw a pathetic, terrified old man. Clara, he mouthed, his eyes pleading. I sat up straight, adjusted the collar of my cheap, thrift store blazer, and held his gaze. I didn't blink. I didn't cry. I just watched him drown. The legal term is dismissed with prejudice. It means the charges against me were not only dropped, but they could never be filed again. But there was no quiet exit, no graceful transition back to normal life. The moment Judge Caldwell struck his gavel and declared me a free woman, the double doors of courtroom 4B swung open. Agent Thomas Sterling and 3 other federal marshals marched down the center aisle. They didn't wait for Richard to step down from the witness box. Richard Higgins, Agent Sterling announced, his voice carrying over the frantic buzzing of the gallery. You are under arrest for perjury, bribery of a public official, federal wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. Get your hands off me! My father shrieked as they wrenched his arms behind his back, slapping the heavy steel cuffs over his bespoke Tom Ford suit. I built this city. You are nothing. I'll have your badges for this. As they dragged him down the aisle, he looked desperately toward the gallery. Sylvia, call Pierce and Vance. Call the legal team. Get me out of here. But Sylvia wasn't looking at him. She was already power walking out the side exit, dragging a bewildered Beatrice by the wrist. Sylvia had survived 2 marriages to wealthy men before my father. She knew exactly what a sinking ship looked like, and she had no intention of going down with the captain. The fallout was biblical. It was the hardest, fastest strike of karma I had ever witnessed. Within 24 hours, Higgins Heritage Realty's stock plummeted by 60%. The board of directors convened an emergency midnight session and voted unanimously to terminate my father as CEO, stripping him of all executive privileges and halting his severance package pending the federal investigation. But the real betrayal, the one that broke Richard Higgins, more than the handcuffs or the lost fortune, came from his own home. 2 days after his arrest, while Richard was sitting in the exact same cold, concrete holding cell I had occupied, Sylvia filed for an expedited divorce. In a masterstroke of self-preservation, she went directly to the federal prosecutors and offered them everything. She surrendered my father's private journals, his secondary burner phones, and the keys to a hidden safe in their wine cellar. In exchange for immunity, she testified that she had overheard Richard discussing the bribes with Commissioner Garmon. She threw him to the wolves without a second thought. Beatrice's trust fund, which was tied to the company's equity, was frozen by the feds. Her designer cars were repossessed right out of the mansion's driveway by federal agents seizing assets purchased with illicit funds. The paparazzi caught it all on camera, the golden child, screaming at agents in her silk pajamas as her custom Porsche was towed away. As for me, the state issued a formal apology. It didn't erase the 6 months of terror, the eviction, or the public humiliation, but it cleared my name completely. Kai Pendleton, the overworked public defender who had stood by me, suddenly found himself the most sought-after defense attorney in Washington state. I bought him a bottle of the most expensive scotch I could find with my very first settlement check, because, as it turned out, framing your daughter for a federal crime while using your own company's security apparatus to plant evidence opens you up to a massive civil lawsuit. I didn't sue my father. I sued Higgins Heritage Realty for wrongful termination, defamation, and malicious prosecution. The board, desperate to bleed the poison from their brand and avoid another highly publicized trial, settled out of court in less than a month. The settlement was an 8-figure sum, enough to ensure I would never have to look at a ledger in a windowless basement ever again. 3 weeks later, the preliminary hearings for the United States versus Richard Higgins began. I sat in the front row of the gallery. I wore a tailored suit, a silent testament to the wealth I had clawed back from the ashes of his betrayal. When they led my father into the courtroom, the transformation was jarring. He wasn't wearing Tom Ford. He was wearing an oversized bright orange county jumpsuit. His silver hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was greasy and flat. The arrogance was entirely gone, hollowed out by the realization that his money could no longer protect him. He looked around the courtroom, searching the faces in the gallery. He was looking for Sylvia. He was looking for Beatrice. He found no one. They hadn't bothered to show up. Then, his eyes met mine. He stopped walking. The marshals had to nudge him forward. In his eyes, I saw the crushing weight of his reality. The empire was gone. The perfect family was a mirage. The only person left in the room who shared his blood was the daughter he had tried to destroy. As he was forced to sit at the defense table, defeated and completely alone, I leaned forward, resting my arms on the wooden railing. I remembered the words he had screamed at me, the words that had echoed through the media for months. I didn't have to say a word. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, but the headline of the Seattle Times resting on the reporter's lap next to me said it all. It read, "The real embarrassment. Higgins patriarch faces 30 years as empire crumbles." The sentencing of Richard Higgins took place on a bitter, wind-swept Tuesday in January. It had been 8 months since my own trial had spectacularly imploded in this very building. The atmosphere in Judge Caldwell's courtroom was drastically different this time. Gone was the media circus desperately trying to tear down a young woman. In its place was a solemn, heavy anticipation of watching a titan officially fall. Richard had aged a decade in less than a year. The county jail had stripped him of his customized hair dyes, his tailored suits, and his daily massages. He looked frail, his shoulders stooped under the scratchy fabric of his orange uniform. His high-priced defense attorneys had tried every trick in the book: delay tactics, motions to suppress, even attempting to claim Richard was suffering from early-onset dementia. But Judge Caldwell, a man who possessed a memory like a steel trap and zero tolerance for perjury, denied every single one. When it was time for the sentencing, Richard was asked to stand. He clutched the edge of the defense table, his knuckles pale. "Mr. Higgins," Judge Caldwell began, his voice echoing with absolute finality, "in my 30 years on the bench, I have presided over cases of immense greed and profound cruelty. But the sheer calculation of your crimes stands in a class of its own. You did not just steal millions of taxpayer dollars to line your own pockets. You actively, maliciously framed your own daughter, throwing her to the wolves to serve as a decoy for your corruption. You manipulated the justice system, and you lied under oath in this very courtroom." Richard kept his eyes glued to the floor. He didn't have the courage to look up. "The court finds no mitigating factors," Caldwell continued, adjusting his glasses, "for the charges of federal wire fraud, bribery, perjury, and obstruction of justice. I sentence you to a total of 35 years in federal prison, to be served consecutively, without the possibility of parole." A collective gasp echoed through the gallery, followed immediately by a profound, heavy silence. 35 years. For a man of his age, it was a guaranteed death sentence behind bars. He would never breathe free air again. As the marshals stepped forward to escort him away, Richard finally turned his head. He looked past his attorneys, past the sketch artists, and locked eyes with me. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to hurl one final insult. But I didn't wait to hear it. I simply stood up, turned my back on him, and walked out of the courtroom. That chapter of my life was permanently closed. While Richard's fate was sealed in concrete and steel, the rest of the Higgins family discovered that karma possessed a wicked sense of irony. Sylvia had believed she was untouchable. She had traded my father's deepest secrets for federal immunity, confidently moving into a luxury condo in Bellevue while she waited for the dust to settle, assuming she would ride out the storm on her alimony and hidden assets. But Sylvia had profoundly underestimated the sheer reach of the government. The Department of Justice had granted her immunity from criminal prosecution regarding the bribery ring. They had not, however, granted her immunity from the Internal Revenue Service. Because Sylvia had jointly signed Richard's fraudulent tax returns for the past 7 years, the IRS held her fully liable for the unpaid taxes, penalties, and interest on the millions of dollars hidden in the Cayman Islands. They audited her with a brutality that bordered on the microscopic. Within 6 months, her bank accounts were frozen, her luxury condo was seized, and her remaining jewelry was auctioned off by the federal government. The woman who had once scoffed at anything less than 5-star service was forced to move into a tiny, 2-bedroom apartment in a rundown neighborhood, completely bankrupted. Beatrice, stripped of her trust fund and her status, found out very quickly how shallow her elite social circle truly was. The friends who used to drink her expensive champagne and ride on her father's yacht stopped returning her calls overnight. Unemployable in the corporate world due to her lack of actual skills and her radioactive last name, she was last seen working as a shift manager at a mid-tier retail clothing store, furiously dodging paparazzi, who occasionally dropped by just to snap a photo of her sweeping the floors. As for the empire my father built, Higgins Heritage Realty was completely liquidated to pay the massive fines levied by the city and the federal government. The Highland Creek project was handed over to a reputable developer. The famous Higgins Tower downtown was bought by a foreign investment firm and entirely rebranded. In less than 2 years, the Higgins name was scrubbed from the Seattle skyline forever. And then there was me. With the 8-figure settlement I secured from the company, I could have easily vanished to a tropical island and never worked another day in my life. But the terror I felt in that holding cell, the utter helplessness of being crushed by a system manipulated by wealth and power, had changed me. I took my money and I invested it in the one person who had stood by me when I had absolutely nothing. Kai Pendleton and I opened our own law and accounting firm right in the heart of Seattle. We specialized in forensic auditing and legal defense for the wrongfully accused, providing top-tier, well-funded representation to people who, like me, were being crushed by corporate giants. I never received a father's love, and I never got the perfect family. But as I sat in my spacious, sunlit corner office, looking out over the city skyline, I realized I had gotten something infinitely better. I had dragged the truth into the light. I had survived the fire, and I had built a legacy entirely my own. If Clara's journey from the windowless basement to absolute vindication gave you chills, hit that like button. Betrayal runs deep, but karma always collects its debts. Share this video with someone who loves a jaw-dropping true story of justice served cold. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another unbelievable, real-life drama. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Comment below.